Good evening. My name is Mark Bain-Smith. I'm chaplain up at the University of Reading, as all of you know, and welcome to Café Théologique. Café Théologique is something that we do twice a term, and I forgot to ask the music to be turned off. Charles, would you mind having a chat with the bar? Café Théologique happens twice a term. We invite a theologian or somebody with some thought about spiritual ideas to come into our august surroundings here in 0 Degrees Bar and to talk about the topic that really interests them, and then to have space for people to talk to one another and to reflect back to the speaker. So it's not really a formal lecture, it's more of a kind of informal discussion. Rather different kind of guest this evening. Actually, my up till now co-host for 4 years, Susie Templeton. So a pioneer minister in Reading for the past 5 years, and has moved around a number of churches, plugged some gaps, experienced the pandemic as well. Her background is in biology at the university, and also has a past career doing support for people pastoral care in the Royal Navy. I know she's a keen scuba diver. What she's going to be talking about tonight is coming out of a master's thesis which she did for theology in mission and ministry, connecting up something that was passionate for her with her her work as a pioneer minister. Before I hand over to that, though, I'm just going to pause for a moment and say a thank you, because for the last 4 years, I have run this with Susie online and in person, and it's really tough to do this on your own. So to have somebody to be with you has been lovely. Susie's about to leave in a few weeks' time. I think so, in a few weeks' time, to go down to the Lizard Peninsula and take over as a pioneer minister in a team right on the tip of the southwest of this country of Cornwall. And you might get to do some practical things with the sea there as well, in a way you can't in Reading. Now, I have a card which I'm going to pass round at the drinks moment. So if you'd like to sign a card, that would be lovely. But we do also have a present. Ilano, come and present a present. I have a bottle of champagne for you. And a round of applause before we start.
Thank you so much.
So I'm going to hand over to Susie now. The sea as a space of spiritual encounter, exploring mission in a post-secular world.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah, it's a bit of a strange feeling. We booked this before we knew it would be my last one. And it's been something, I finished the Masters 2 years ago, and then entered a bit of a traumatic time in my personal life. And so this has been the first time I've looked back at it. So it's been a rigorous experience over the last few weeks, but been good, especially now knowing that I'm going to go and live about a mile from the beach. Yeah, I'll be able to see the sea from my bedroom. So I'm quite excited about that. So thanks for coming. I'm assuming that you're all here because, like me, you find the sea a very powerful and emotive place, and that it's somewhat interested in how that links with a spirituality. And so I'm going to operate from that assumption during this talk. A little bit more about me, I suppose. I was born in Portsmouth. I grew up on the South Coast, spent some time as a child in Southeast Asia because my dad was in the Navy. Then learned to scuba dive on my gap year, and proceeded to go and study biology after spending 10 weeks surveying coral reefs for damage. And that began a lifelong love affair with the underwater world, which I think has been rooted earlier, but really I think the experience of being underwater and engaging in the underwater world was quite profound on my young adult self. So I wanted to talk about this topic for my dissertation because I just had this growing sense, and especially the last 5 or 6 years not being near the sea, had noticed the big hole that it left And so I thought, well, at least I can talk about it and write about it, even if I can't live near it. So there was just a sense I had that I wasn't the only one that felt like a draw to the sea. And I think on lots of levels, you know, we're an island nation. And even if we don't live near the sea, we've got quite a strong relationship with it. We're quite dependent on the sea to import things through ships and stuff. And it's obviously having a coast in the way that we do compared to some of the other countries close to us has been quite a defining thing in our history, our social and political and I guess spiritual history as well. So there was a sense, I think, that we have a special relationship with the sea as a society, as a culture. And I wanted to just explore what that meant for me, because I had a sense that it was something that was shared. So the research I did was actually specifically to talk to people who self-identified as spiritual but not religious, because I wanted to listen really carefully to people who were experiencing the sea as a spiritual place outside of the institutions of faith, and to see what was going on out in the wild, literally, you know, like what is happening beyond our kind of organized borders, if you like. Because I get the sense that sometimes the church would do well to listen a bit more carefully to what's happening outside. And so really that guided my choice of people who I spoke to in quite depth, and that frames the comments that I get, that I've got, you know, the work that I've got coming from that place. Obviously, I'm coming from a faith vantage point, and so I wanted to put what I heard from these people into conversation with our faith traditions, and I've attempted to do that. So the themes that arose from the data and the conversations I was having, I've tried to then put them into conversation with our Christian traditions in some way, but it's only scratching the surface. So disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I feel like this is the start of a conversation, and I'm really excited at the amount of interest that has been, even just in tonight, with other people who feel the same way. And I think it's a really great opportunity to continue some of that conversation, and to hear what you guys think a bit later. So I think those were all the kind of setup points, context points that I wanted to before we sort of get into it, really. So let's have a look. The big theme, really, I mean, the big headline for the themes I found was connection. Okay, so in various ways, in various forms, it seemed to be that a lot of what people were saying about their experience with the sea was a form of connection. And I kind of categorized those connections into three. So there was a connection with the other, the sort of the bigger, you know, and then there was a connection with myself. There was an internal connection, and then there was a connection with community. So the connection with others, other people. And so we're going to look a little bit at those three categories. And then there were some really delightful little things that came up at the end, which we'll mention if we have time. But my focus in the dissertation, and the data was much more rich, but my focus in the dissertation was about this. So the first one, and the obvious place to start really, is this connection to the other. So encountering the divine beyond myself, something that's bigger, something that's beyond, I think. And for a lot of people, that was beyond a kind of even words, you know, it was a very emotional thing. So I'm hoping to let the data do the talking, really, and just add a few reflections in without trying to crowd out or force my opinions on things. But these are a couple of the quotes that I picked out that came from my interviews. So someone said, you're just right in the middle of the whole cosmos. And you feel like I'm just a dot in this whole thing. I don't particularly understand, but I'm enjoying it. A lot of the people I spoke to were swimmers. That wasn't intentional. That was just how I spoke to 9 people. And most, I think about 6 of them were sea swimmers. And so that was very interesting in itself. And obviously swimming, if you're in the water, you've got a particular point compared to being on the water, if you like, if you're in a boat or a ship. And everyone I spoke to was in experiencing and enjoying the water recreationally rather than professionally. And then, you know, when you're there, you kind of feel like you're part of something bigger than you, which is how I imagine it feels to have a real strong faith in God. And I thought that was a lovely kind of kind of summarizes why I wanted to do this research, really, because it's listening to how God is connecting, or how other people are connecting in that way without the language that we might use as people with a faith. I'm making that assumption there because that's where I'm coming from, not that all of you actually do have a faith, because you might not. Anyway, so the big question with this is transcendence and immanence. And encountering God in nature is like this huge tradition in Christianity, right? And so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to get my head around Christian philosophy as it emerged. So I'm definitely not going to field any questions about that. But the conversation between this experience that came in the data and Christian tradition, it's a good place to start. And I read a really good book by this chap, John Chrysavgis, I think. He's an archdeacon in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he wrote a book he's written a lot about creation, but he wrote a book called Creation as Sacrament, which I found very helpful. And the Orthodox Church have a very strong, a very robust kind of understanding of how creation relates to us in terms of faith. So he describes this kind of balance as, on the one hand, God being markedly recognizable in the beauty and sanctity of the world. So that's immanence. And then on the other hand, being perceived to be above and beyond anything in the world. And that is what we would call transcendence. And so this question about how and can and what it looks like to encounter God in nature, generally in creation, is always going to be a discussion, a balance between these two kind of endpoints. And yeah, so it was a really common response in the interviews to have this sense of being connected to something bigger. And then counterintuitively, that brought about a shift in perspective that led to feelings of connection. Like that you were small, actually. Sorry. The starting point was I'm just a little dot, and then it brought about this connection to something much bigger. And yeah, as I said, the discussion about how we understand God's presence in the natural world, in the created order, and his relationship to the created order is a big topic, I would say. So a quick summary of the intellectual tradition, as I called it, began in Alexandria back in the day. And folks like Clement and Origen and Plotinus, they produced the tradition there of Christian Platonists. And they were challenging Gnostic thought in the world in response to God's relationship with created order. Out of that emerged Neoplatonism, and that then influenced right into the 6th century. And they came up with all kinds of ideas. So the thoughts evolved, basically. The two people that I'm going to just, again, the words of John Chrysavgis. So the first one is about Eriugena, who was an Irish-born, that's what it means, born from Irish John Scott Eriugena. So in effect, creation itself is a mode of divine existence. And then Nicholas Cusa was a mathematician in the 15th century, and he was studying infinity, and he wrote of God as the face of all faces, which in turn is beheld in every human face. So in this sense, the absolute face of God is discovered on the face of the entire world. So those were two quite helpful thoughts, locating this idea for me in my processes in our church history. But obviously, you could probably write a whole thesis on that. And that's not what I was going to do. So I dragged my head out of that rabbit hole and went back to the data. And what was coming out of the data was some really interesting things in regard to this. So what I was hearing from people was a sense of, yes, the sea connects me to something bigger. Some people would understand that as God. Some people would understand that as something a bit more less or a bit more ambiguous. But for some of them, it was the sea itself that they connected with. And there was a sense that the sea had a character and was a distinct being, a distinct kind of entity, if you like. And some lovely stories about how they interacted with the sea. And these two quotes are examples of them. The first one I found really profound, that I've always had a sense of the sea as being something that was somehow animate, something that's alive in some way, and very ancient, as if it's something that's experienced so much that meaning has been left there. And we reflected together on how it feels when you go into a very old church or a cathedral, when there's been a sort of habituation of meaning there. The space has been kind of impregnated with meaning over centuries of people praying and worshipping, getting married and having funerals and all of those sorts of things. That's how she felt the sea kind of was as well. And then a bit more of a practical thing. So again, a swimmer, reflecting that there's a symbiosis. When we swim well in the water kind of helps us. We work with the water, offers upholding, but I'm also using it. And she felt like there was this really intimate interaction there between her and the water. And I think that's quite interesting, because all the way through, I'm quite trying to focus in on how the sea is distinctive, as opposed to maybe a lake or a river or water in other forms. And I think there's something about the rhythms of the tides and the currents and the sea just being such an expanse that sets it apart. And the other thing that came out of this, so when I was thinking about the sea having some kind of relationship, can we have a relationship with the sea, like as opposed to the mountains, or there's some biblical images of Jesus particularly interacting with the waters. So when he calms the storm in Mark 4, and when he walks on water in Matthew 14, and then obviously the parting of the Red Sea was God did the heavy lifting there, I think, but Moses was involved. He participated because he had to put out his staff. So there is a kind of hint of this relationship in the Bible that we can reflect on. But my reflections really to this is why this perception that we can relate to the sea as almost another being, a character, personality, perhaps because we have a vocation, perhaps it's a vocational thing. It's about who we are. We relate to the sea because we are image bearers of the Creator who relates to the sea. So we mirror that, and we carry that with us. Also, perhaps it's a metaphor. We relate to the sea because it reminds us of God, and so it points us to him, a bit like an icon. And then there's something about the presence. We relate to the sea because God dwells in all things, and so we are relating to his presence in the sea. So those were sort of three reflections that I drew out of the conversations that I had, maybe trying to explain a bit about what this was going on, because for contemporary Christian, kind of discussion, to talk about the sea as a person isn't, that needs a bit of unpacking, needs a bit of reflection. So that was my attempt to do that. But I still find that a really interesting question, and what's going on there. And I think it's probably going to be a rich kind of way of trying to dig into that a little bit. I suspect for most people, it's a mixture of these three. There's different things going on, and there's different elements to it. But yeah. And then part of this was the observation, which came up in pretty much every interview I did, that the sea has lots of moods. So here, every day is different. It might be flat and smooth. It might be like today was really wavy, but they were kind of quite gentle, kind waves. And some days it's really slappy and it's frightening. Some days I'm scared to go in. I don't know what it's going to do. And then another observation, that you have to fit in with it, especially living here. So by the coast, there are quite a few places that are cut off by the tide. So if you're walking, you have to know when the tide's coming in, otherwise you're just stuck there for like 6 hours until it goes out again. And so this paradox of moods, where actually most of the people I spoke to, it wasn't like, oh yeah, the sea can be a really awful place sometimes. It's like, yeah, the sea can be really rough, can't it? Then it was the disruption of the sea was almost more appealing, more interesting, more exciting than like our lovely, calm, still waters, Caribbean beaches and that kind of thing. And I found that really interesting. What does that say? And also this reminder that we have limitations. So the sea forces us into a position where we are reminded of our limitations in lots of ways, whether that's the tides coming in and out, or whether that's what we can cope with when we're in the sea, or whether that's, maneuvering equipment like a boat or something. The sea is beyond our control. And there was a little bit of reflection about, why is that so appealing? Why is it so appealing? And someone said to me, she's like, oh, my job, I'm in control of everything. I have so much responsibility. It's really nice to go and be in a place where I'm not in control, and to respect that. And then someone else, which was quite nice, said it's a bit like Aslan, Yeah, he's good, but he's not safe. And I thought, yeah, that kind of helps me think about the sea is good, but not safe. Like even when the sea is calm, you have to know what you're doing, and can change on a whim. So yeah, with that in mind, these kinds of thoughts, I started to look at the desert tradition. So again, I'm not an expert. I'm not going to go into I don't know loads about this, but as a summary, the desert elders, the desert fathers and mothers went out into the deserts of Egypt when we had this shift from Christianity being like the outlaw religion to being the empire religion. So when Constantine made it official. And it was a response against that, because up till then, if you were a Christian, your life was at stake, basically. And then suddenly, overnight, it became politically acceptable, if not advantageous, to be a Christian. So there's all kinds of backlash. And you had these people that wanted to escape that, and they went out into the desert. And the desert was also a place that was dangerous, it was full of wild beasts, and spiritually they thought it was full of demons. The Jews understand water as meaning life. So the desert was a place with no life. It had no water. And yet the experience of the desert elders was that pushing out into that place of danger and wilderness was an incredible spiritual adventure. And really, it birthed the monastic movement as we know it today. And so there's loads of things to go into there, which I won't tonight. But as monasticism developed and it moved out of the desert, moved across Europe, and it arrived in the British Isles, the Celts that received it contextualized the practice. And the sea became a proxy for the desert, because we don't have any deserts here, do we? Not yet, and certainly not 1,000 years ago or whenever it was. So we see this connection, and that for me was a big then influence on how I interpreted my data, with the connection to the desert tradition and everything that has birthed for us in our faith tradition. So yeah, here is just extract. The ocean consisted of chaotic waters left over when God created the seas, rivers, and lakes. So the Celtic monks understood the wilderness of the sea to be dangerous, full of demons, in the way that the desert was for St. Anthony. The sea was a place for spiritual battles, the wrestling of the inner life that was such a feature of the desert discipleship. And the biblical connotations of the ocean as a place of chaos, monsters, and evil invited those seeking encounter with God to face their own inner demons. So you've got all these stories of like Celtic saints standing up to their neck in freezing cold water, praying for hours on end. And some monasteries carved into the rocks, in Ireland, looking out into the sea. And they just go and sit in a little hole in the side of the cliff and meditate for, well, ages, I guess. And so I found that really interesting, thinking about, I'm speaking to people who are in the British Isles, and that's a contextual kind of experience, spiritual experience, contemporary times, reflecting back that actually a lot of these things we're finding have been part of our tradition and the way the faith has been expressed in this location over the centuries. Yeah, so shall I go on, or yeah? So the second kind of category was a connection to myself. So not obviously me as Susie, but to the person who's having the experiences. And this was here. This was really quite moving. The two subcategories of this. Okay. So there are two subcategories of this, really, you could sum up as one being about identity and belonging, or homecoming, and the other being about healing. And I'll be honest, I was so moved by the openness that some of the people I spoke to shared with me, some really deep stories and really lovely. Well, actually, they weren't very lovely stories, but they were very powerful stories. And this is a quote about someone who had been living away, as you can see, living in Sheffield for 25 years, and kind of lost touch with that part of her, that we were talking about earlier, how much the sea is part of my being and how much it makes sense to me. There's been this sense of reconnection, I'm home. This sense of belonging here by the sea. And that was repeated in quite a lot of, so some of the people I spoke to could never imagine living anywhere else. They'd lived by the sea their whole lives, but about half had lived somewhere else, moved away for uni or whatever, and then had come back for lots of different reasons. And I just want to find in here. Yeah, so this idea of connecting to myself and identity and belonging. The desert elders, in all of their searching and wrestling and their whole tradition, were essentially trying to ask, what does it mean to be human? How can we be more human? How can we be more authentic, more alive? And that's kind of trickled out as people came to see them and ask their advice, and we recorded stories and sayings from them. And as this connected in the British Isles with the Celts who were there, the pre-Christian tribes, they kind of inherited this tradition. And Philip Sheldrake said this, that the Celts' understanding of God's reality was about being at home. So the reality of God was about coming home to yourself. The divine presence was something immediate and intimate, rather than something distant. And so we've got here this tradition of finding in that connection, and that maybe the connection to nature that was so important for those early Celtic versions of the church, and this discipleship journey, I guess, of getting closer to God and also getting closer to ourselves, and that sort of being two sides of the same coin. There was a tradition that believed one particular location in a sacred landscape was especially potent for an individual or a group spirituality, and this was known as their place of resurrection. So there was one place where they went, for each person a personal individual place, and should a wandering ascetic ever settle somewhere, it was believed he had found this place that would bring him personally closer to heaven. I'm not sure if that's the same idea as thin places, but it might be related. And then healing, which, really elicited so many. I was glad I was partially experienced, and it was really profound. And I felt really honoured to have these stories shared with me, because I was essentially a stranger to these people. So I'm really grateful for the gift of those stories. But this is a reflection about healing. I can't think of a more perfect place to heal. You feel so small, don't you? Really, we're all so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But actually being by the ocean, it reminds you of that, but it's really comforting. I think being at the beach is one of those places where I'm able to really feel my feelings. And I thought that was a really interesting observation for that person. This I found very powerful. I had a traumatic experience. I came back feeling broken and ugly. I found that the sea was a place of healing and affirmation of me as a whole woman. Being in the sea was a place of joy and strength. I visited a local church when it was open, it was a lockdown at the time, but I could not find the healing or spiritual presence I found in the ocean. The ocean makes me feel whole, accepted, part of creation, held, beautiful and strong. I just thought, wow, if you're talking about a spiritual encounter and what we as the institution can learn from people's experiences, then I don't think you can get more profound than that, really. And wouldn't we all want to be in a church that makes us feel whole, accepted, part of creation, held, beautiful and strong? There's a vision for you. And again, going back to the desert traditions, like the desert elders were really strong on the fact that we're all a bit broken inside. We all have these inner wounds and deep marks on our hearts that need healing. And carrying these wounds is part of being human. So that in itself, being wounded is part of our identity in the fallen world, but they need to be tended to. We need to face up to them. and not ignore them. And I heard a lot of stories of people doing exactly that. One girl had a generational trauma in that her grandmother had committed suicide by going into the sea. And so she'd always been scared of the ocean because this had happened in her family and obviously had a really profound impact. And she decided, and I'm so in awe of this, but she decided, I'm going to learn to swim in the sea. And I'm going to swim. There was a race that she kind of, and she did her training swims on the same beach because she felt like it was so important to face up to this, to see it head on. And, incredible bravery, I think. And she did. She learned to swim, and it's become a place of healing. And it's become something that she's evolved into. And I think that's amazing. And another story of someone who lost a child, and she said, I wanted to go in the sea and just swim away. I didn't want to come back. And she was so deep in grief. But she found that through swimming, she found hope. And she found her way back to herself. And so when we talk about healing, actually, the stories I've heard are very profound healing, physically, yes, but in a very deep emotional way. And, big stakes, not just kind of, not that being depressed or having bad mental health, it's all obviously all part of it. But, this is like seriously people who didn't want to be alive anymore, finding that they were going to be healed. And I think that's quite amazing, really. Yeah, and so I'll just go on to the final one, was connection to community. So encountering the divine in other people. And I was doing this 2 years ago, so we had just come out of the lockdown experience. And so a lot of people were reflecting on that experience as well, which is kind of like an extra layer to what the data was showing. And the experience of the swimmers particularly had been that whether they had started swimming as a response to lockdown or they had seen more people come, they found a community. And there was I spoke to a wonderful person from up north, and he had some great tales about how this group had grown and how they supported each other, and really seen a vibrant community emerge that had helped each other through the trauma of lockdown, and some really interesting reflections coming out of that as we are with each other. So it's not just a personal individual thing, it's not just about me and God, this is definitely a communal thing. And this reflection from someone about, again, from a swimmer's perspective, but that there's a rawness to it, a vulnerability. The fact that you're almost naked as you're getting changed under your beach towel leaves you feeling quite vulnerable. But in a really good way. It's like a sort of daring to take off the layers that we hide behind. And there was a real sense of the sea as a therapeutic space, that these communities were not just, that they went beyond just having a laugh with some mates, although there was definitely lots of laughter going on, that when you were in the water, you could talk about stuff in a really free way because you were all sort of half naked, and you were all cold, and you're all in the same place, I guess. And that brought a freedom to people talking about big things like the fears and emotions, and kind of like what is said in the sea stays in the sea, so we could go out and kind of share about all this stuff, and then when we come back in, it's like that therapist couch kind of deal, and I think that's really important when we were trying to process stuff. We were all trying to process a big trauma from the pandemic, let alone whatever's going on in individual people's lives. And this idea of building relationships, again, when the desert elders went out into the wilderness, they were seeking solitude, and they were seeking silence and connection with God. But what ended up happening is people followed them. So they didn't stay on their own very long, or maybe some of the more grumpy ones did, but they had to keep moving on. And these little communities popped up right on the margins of empire. And people would come and seek them and bring them their problems and what do I do about this? And then some of them would stay, they wouldn't go back to the cities, they would stay and they would join in with the monastic lifestyle. And the aim above all else was to seek God. You know, it wasn't we have to be silent or we have to be on our own, but that those were pathways to putting God first. And out of that grew life, out of that grew community. And as we said earlier, like out of that grew this whole monastic tradition that rejuvenated the church across Europe, and has done consistently throughout times of difficulty and transition for the church. It's been the monastic movement that has brought new life. So, you know, quite a powerful kind of, connection there, I think. And it was really interesting to reflect on that and these stories of community that I was hearing. So, the last bit of it, or the other half of it really is what does this mean then for us? This is what I heard. Those were the things I heard. There were also really some other beautiful reflections that I didn't get to go into. One person talked about treasure hunting. So when she was on the beach with her kids, and they would always try and find, trying to find little bits of sea glass or shells or whatever. And it became this whole pattern and ritual for them that they were going out to seek the treasures. And we talked a little bit about how that, as a practice, kind of resonated with Ignatian spirituality of noticing and examine and that kind of thing. And then there was someone else who was talking about how it was a liminal space, it was how it was a boundary. You cross the boundary of the sea from the shore to the water, and how your experiences flip. And again, that's something that I think would be really rich to mine that for insight into how we are and who we are. That question, how can we be more human? How can we be more alive when we're on a boundary plane? But yeah, so my reflections on how this is useful rather than just interesting are that the sea can be both a location for mission and a resource for it. So it's and when I talk about mission, I think it's worth sort of like thinking about what you mean by mission, because I'm thinking a lot broader than like conversion, but one of the things, here we go. Obviously healing was a really big theme, and it's been very personal for me because of my personal journey. A loved one falling sick just as I handed this in, actually, and now being bereaved. I feel like some of those conversations really helped prepare me for this time of this season of bereavement, because I heard how other people had faced stuff, and actually found that the sea was a real sanctuary for them. And we all need healing, don't we? There's so much brokenness in the world around us, and I think particularly as a consequence of the lockdown. There's a chap called Hans Kung. Have you heard of him? Is he German? I think he's German. And he wrote a lot, but he said that the mission of God is creation healed, I think is the quote, which I do have in my. Let me just check that that's correct. The kingdom of God is creation healed. And so this idea that when we talk about mission and seeking the kingdom of God, we're seeking healing, really resonated for me in looking at this, what I was hearing from people and their experiences of the sea. And the idea also that the Greek word for salvation is the root word for healing and wholeness. And for me, that's been something that's quite influenced me over the last few years in how I approach mission and seeing that we've got this kind of vocation, right? To see healing happen, to bring wholeness. That's what the gospel is, the good news for the world, that we can see restoration. But there's obviously also mission as connection. So there's a lot of stuff in here about connection, but I probably think about connecting with people and sharing with people, and talk about a missional dialogue, that it's not about us having all the answers as people of faith, but just about how can we inform each other and what can we learn from each other, to move towards a truth where we're all more connected to God, however we understand that. And then I think one of the other things that comes up in the idea of being the sea being dangerous, and people being with each other, is vulnerability, and that perhaps how can we think about mission as vulnerability, or spirituality of vulnerability that enables us to connect. And maybe these things are all part of each other, but those are just some ideas that I've thrown out. But yeah, I'm not the expert, and I really feel like this is the start of a conversation. So it would be really great. We're going to have a break now, unless you want to say anything or respond to anything, to hear some of your ideas. We'll have a little bit of space for you to go to the loo and get a drink. But yeah, when we come back, as well as any questions, if you want to share any reflections about what you think, because I'd be delighted to hear.